when you take away the New Testament, when you take away Christian writings, we know almost nothing about the Jesus of history, except maybe three things. And when I use the word know, what I mean by that is that the thing that there's probably the greatest consensus around amongst biblical scholars about the Jesus of history. Number one, that he was a Jew, which sounds obvious, but it's a good thing to remind ourselves of every once in a while, and I will remind you of it probably 3 or 4 more times tonight, because it is the single most important fact to know about Jesus. Indeed, the difference between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history is predicated on this one fact, that the Jesus of history was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. And if you keep that in mind, the rest of this evening will make much more sense to you. Number one, he was a Jew. Number two, that sometime in the first half of the first century, he started this Jewish movement for Jews, the purpose of which was to reestablish the kingdom of God. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that actually means, but that was the purpose of Jesus' movement. We are here to establish the kingdom of God. And then number three, that as a result of that movement, he was executed as a state criminal by Rome. That's it. That's all we know about Jesus. And indeed, because that's all we know, most scholars nowadays would say it's not enough, that the whole quest for the historical Jesus is a fool's errand, and that we should stop pretending we can know anything about who Jesus the man was. I disagree. The argument that I make in this book is that if that's all you know about Jesus, it's enough, because while we know very little about Jesus the man, we know almost everything about the world in which he lived. First century Palestine was an era that was very well documented, thanks in large part to the Roman occupation. I mean, whatever you want to say about the Romans, they were very good at documentation. That was sort of that and killing were their two big strengths, and roads, I suppose. They'll throw roads in. We'll give them roads. We know how much a bushel of wheat cost in Jesus' time. And so what I try to do is take what little we know about Jesus, plant him firmly into his time and place, and allow that the world in which he lived and the time in which he lived to define him, to create his biography. And then we can go to the Gospels and analyze the claims of the Gospels according to what we know about the history of the time to decide what is more likely historical or less likely historical. And when you do that experiment, the Jesus that arises is a little bit different than I think the Jesus that perhaps most of us are familiar with.